Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a topic that has absolutely reshaped the corporate landscape over the last few years. We are going to demystify the massive and, let's be honest, often incredibly confusing alphabet soup of corporate sustainability. Now, for a long time, the business world has really struggled to bridge this gap between a human, purpose-driven culture and the hard, quantifiable data that investors and regulators are demanding. So in this explainer, we're going to deconstruct this whole complex landscape. We'll cut right through the noise to show you exactly how to move from building a responsible human culture to tracking the concrete metrics that actually prove it. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the foundation by comparing CSR and ESG. Then we'll decode all that regulatory jargon, break down the 7 key metrics you actually need to care about, look at the strategic architects leading this change, and finally, figure out how to avoid the trap of greenwashing. Section 1. CSR versus ESG, the foundation. Okay, so if you've been in business for a while, you've probably heard people say that ESG is just the new and improved CSR, that CSR is just some outdated buzzword. Well, let's bust that myth right now. Corporate social responsibility is the human experience of purpose. It's what you feel. It's the volunteering, the community engagement, that shared meaning that actually builds your organizational culture. ESG, on the other hand, is the measurable evidence of that responsibility. It's the reporting, the hard data, the outcomes. Here's the absolutely crucial takeaway. CSR builds the culture. ESG captures it. ESG can measure responsible behavior, but it literally cannot create it. So if an organization skips that CSR experience entirely and just jumps straight into an ESG reporting dashboard, they are completely missing the foundation of true sustainability. The folks over at Odyssey Teams outline this really simple but totally critical sequence. Step 1 is the experience. That's your CSR. Imagine, say, a team-building event where employees collaborate to build a prosthetic hand for someone in need. They are experiencing empathy and impact in a very tangible way. That naturally leads to step 2, behavior, because that shared experience creates an emotional connection that genuinely changes how people communicate, how they collaborate, and how they act in the workplace. That is your culture, which finally leads us to step 3, evidence. Those changed, highly engaged behaviors, they show up as measurable outcomes in your ESG reporting, things like lower employee turnover or better health and safety numbers. You simply cannot jump straight to step 3 without putting in the work for the first 2. Section 2, frameworks and rules, making sense of the jargon. All right, so once you have that human foundation locked in, how do we actually measure the evidence? I know, if you've ever felt completely overwhelmed by the acronyms in this space, you are not alone. But we can break this ESG rulebook down into 3 really distinct categories to make it easier. First up, we have standards. Think of things like the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, and SASB. These give you the specific, detailed criteria and the exact metrics you need to report. Second, we have frameworks, like the TCFD for climate disclosures. Frameworks don't hand you exact metrics. It's more like they provide a high-level guiding context, a structure for how to even think about your risks. And finally, regulations. The prime example here is Europe's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD. Regulations are mandatory. They're legally binding laws enforced by government authorities. So, to recap, frameworks guide you, standards give you the specific metrics, and regulations, well, they make it illegal not to do it. Section 3. The 7 key metrics. What to actually track. Now that we know the rules of the game, let's talk about the exact data points regulators and investors actually care about. Honestly, it is so easy to get lost in bloated dashboards, but you really just need to focus on the classic trifecta of E, S, and G. Starting on the environmental side, you've got 3 massive metrics. First, greenhouse gas emissions. You absolutely have to track Scope 1, which are your direct emissions, Scope 2, your purchased energy, and Scope 3, which are the emissions across your entire value chain. Scope 3 is usually the hardest to track, but it's also the most important. Second is energy efficiency. Basically, how much energy are you using and what chunk of that is coming from renewable sources? Third is water and waste, looking at freshwater withdrawal and how much waste you're actually keeping out of landfills through circular economy initiatives. Moving over to the social category, investors want to see diversity, and not just across the general workforce, but critically up at the executive board level. They're also looking closely at health and safety, which is tracked through very specific numbers like the lost time injury frequency rate. And finally, governance. This is really about ethics and compliance. Are you actually auditing your supply chains? Do you have real, functioning anti-corruption and whistleblower policies?
And metric number 7, this is the ultimate test of accountability, ESG-linked pay. Is executive compensation explicitly tied to hitting these sustainability targets? Because let's be real, if the CEO's bonus isn't linked to ESG performance, the whole thing is probably just a PR exercise.
Section 4. The Architect of Change, the CSO. So, knowing those 7 metrics is great, but as we all know, data doesn't collect itself, and it certainly doesn't drive strategic change on its own, which begs a pretty vital question. Who exactly is holding all this ESG architecture together within a company? Let's pivot away from the spreadsheets for a second and talk about strategic leadership. Enter the Chief Sustainability Officer, or CSO. This role is drastically evolving. As this quote nails it, the role is shifting from a compliance-oriented reporter to a strategic architect. You know, back in the day, this was often just some middle management role tucked away in PR or HR, basically there that tick boxes for an annual report. But today, the CSO is a strategic powerhouse. In fact, a recent Strategy N study showed that 98% of companies with top sustainability ratings have a CSO or a comparable function. This is a heavy hitter role now with direct access to the executive board, and their job is to integrate sustainability straight into the company's core financial and operational strategy. Let's look at how this actually plays out across the organization. A mature sustainability strategy doesn't just isolate ESG in one lonely department. It distributes that responsibility across the entire business. You've got finance integrating climate risks right into their financial KPIs. You've got HR busy building that purpose-driven culture we talked about earlier. Procurement is on the front lines wrestling with those tricky Scope 3 supply chain emissions. And sales and marketing are figuring out how to credibly position products without crossing that dangerous line into greenwashing. And right at the center of all of this is the CSO. They act as a central enabler, the orchestrator who links all these different operational units together and reports it all directly to the executive board. Section 5. Avoiding greenwashing, pitfalls and the future. Okay, but here's the catch. Even with a rockstar CSO at the helm, things can still go off the rails if companies focus too heavily on the metrics without that proper foundation. Check this out. Feigenbaum Solutions analyzed 871 European CSRD reports for 2025, and they found a staggering 85% of these reports lacked credible year-on-year comparisons for their emissions data. Only 15% provided complete time series data. Think about that for a second. What does it mean? It means most companies are basically just taking a snapshot of a single year. But ESG isn't about a snapshot. It's about a trajectory. If you're changing your methodologies every single year and you can't actually prove that you are actively reducing your emissions over time, then your reporting is, frankly, useless to sophisticated investors. So let's quickly run through the most critical implementation mistakes organizations are making right now. First, and this goes right back to the beginning of our explainer, starting with the reporting instead of the people and the culture. Second, tracking way too many metrics without doing a formal materiality assessment to figure out what actually matters to your specific business. Third, keeping your ESG data totally siloed away from your core financial systems. Your carbon data needs to be as rigorous as your financial data. Fourth, using those inconsistent methodologies so you can't even compare year over year. And finally, shouting from the rooftops about these ambitious net zero targets in press releases without ever actually establishing a reliable baseline first. A giant, sprawling dataset of questionable accuracy? Yeah, that's a massive red flag for greenwashing. Which brings us perfectly back to our foundational concept. People don't act on what they're told. They act on what they experience. You can put all the standards, regulations, and KPIs in the world into place. But if you want to actually move the needle on those 7 key metrics, it requires genuinely changing human behavior. Culture is, and always will be, the ultimate lever for ESG outcomes. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to challenge how you and your organization approach responsible business. Ask yourself, is your ESG strategy just a reporting checkbox to keep regulators off your back? Or are you actively building the human culture that naturally creates the evidence? Remember, if you start with the people, the metrics will absolutely follow. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this helped clear up that ESG alphabet soup for you. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.